Somewhere in the world right now, a schoolchild opens a history textbook and reads that writing began in Mesopotamia, spread through the Indus Valley, and eventually reached Southeast Asia through Indian traders and Hindu missionaries. That story gets repeated in classrooms, documentaries, and museums on every continent. And for the most part, nobody questions it. But here's the thing. There's a script that has been used in the Philippine archipelago for potentially thousands of years that shares deep structural roots with some of the oldest writing systems on Earth, and that nobody can definitively date, not because the evidence doesn't exist, because nobody agreed on when to look. That script is called Baybayin, and its story doesn't begin where most people think it does. Let's be honest about what Baybayin looks like on the surface. When Spanish missionaries arrived in the Philippines in the 16th century, they found a population that could read and write, not just elites. Ordinary people. To be honest, farmers, traders, women, fishermen, all of them literate in a script they carved into bamboo and leaves. The Spanish were genuinely surprised. Some wrote back to Europe describing their astonishment at the widespread literacy they encountered. The missionaries documented Baybayin carefully. You know, they learned it. Some of them printed religious texts using it, trying to communicate Christian doctrine in a familiar visual language. We have those documents. Well, they survived, and from those documents, scholars built a portrait of what Baybayin looked like in the 1500s. Wait a second. The problem? That's basically where the certainty ends. Because Baybayin belongs to a family of scripts, the Brahmic family, that descended from ancient Indian writing traditions. Most of its cousins, scripts like Javanese, Balinese, Buginese, and Batak, all carry traces of their Indian origins in verifiable historical records. Merchants traveled. Priests carried manuscripts. Inscriptions with dates got carved into stone. You can trace the migration. With Baybayin, the trail goes cold, very fast. And where it goes cold is exactly where things get fascinating. Here's what linguists and paleographers actually know. Baybayin shares unmistakable structural features with the Kawi script, an old Javanese writing system used roughly from the 8th century onward. Both are abugidas, meaning each character represents a consonant with an inherent vowel sound that can be modified using diacritic marks. The logic of the system is identical. The shapes of certain characters are strikingly similar. The relationship is real. But, and this is a significant but, the similarities don't prove direct descent. They could indicate a shared ancestor, something older than Kawi itself. That shared ancestor, if it existed, might connect Baybayin not just to medieval Java, but to something running deeper through maritime Southeast Asia. Something that predates the Hindu and Buddhist cultural waves that reshaped the region in the first millennium of the Common Era. Researchers have pointed toward an ancestral proto-script tradition in the region, a tradition that may have emerged, spread, and diversified long before any Indian merchant ship dropped anchor off the coast of Luzon. The Sanskrit connection complicates everything further. Sanskrit, or more precisely, the Brahmi script, from which Sanskrit's written form evolved, gets treated as the fountainhead of all South and Southeast Asian writing. The standard model says Brahmi appeared around the 3rd century BCE, spread under Emperor Ashoka's administration, and eventually gave rise to dozens of daughter scripts across Asia. Under that model, everything in the Philippine script tradition would trace back to India. Arriving sometime between the 9th and 13th centuries CE. But Brahmi's own dating is contested in ways that rarely make it into popular history. There are scholars, serious, credentialed, institutionally affiliated scholars, who argue that Brahmi's origins push back further than Ashoka. Let's say, possibly much further. The debate over whether Brahmi was invented, borrowed from Phoenician or Aramaic traders, or evolved from an older indigenous Indus Valley tradition has never fully closed. The Indus Valley script itself remains undeciphered. Let's say we genuinely don't know what it says, or whether it connects to Brahmi at all. So the timeline that places Indian writing before Filipino writing rests on a foundation that has its own unresolved cracks. Now here's where the chaos really begins. The Philippine Islands didn't preserve Baybayin on stone. That's the core of the archaeological problem, and it wasn't a failure of intelligence or cultural priority. It was climate. It was ecology. The archipelago's heat, humidity, typhoons, and biological activity destroy organic material with extraordinary efficiency. Bamboo rots. Leaves decompose. Even treated wood doesn't last centuries in that environment. The cultures that wrote on stone, in Java, in Cambodia, in India, left a trail. The cultures that wrote on palm leaves and bamboo left almost nothing. Almost. There are a handful of surviving pre-colonial artifacts with script. The most famous is the Laguna copperplate inscription, discovered in 1989 by a man who found it at a riverside antique market and almost sold it as scrap metal. Almost. That single word changes Philippine history. All right. The inscription is dated to 900 CE. It's written in a mixture of Old Malay, Old Javanese, and Old Tagalog, and it demonstrates that the Philippines was already part of a sophisticated, multilingual maritime network at that time. It mentions debts being forgiven, names of places still recognizable today, and a social structure of considerable complexity. It's not a primitive document. It reads like a legal record. But 900 CE is not the origin of the script. It's a snapshot, a freeze frame of a tradition already in motion. Nobody carves a legal document in a script that was invented last week. The people who wrote the Laguna copperplate inscription were working in a writing tradition that had already matured. How long had it been maturing? We don't know. That's the void that researchers keep staring into. Stop for a second and consider what that void actually means. Every civilization that left stone inscriptions gets a datable history. Every civilization that wrote on organic materials gets a question mark. The Philippines didn't choose bamboo because it lacked sophistication. Maritime cultures adapted to the materials their environment provided. The forest gave bamboo. The coast gave shells. The sea gave trade routes, not quarries. And so history, in the way that Western academic institutions have traditionally measured it, through stone and ceramic survivability, gave the Philippines a silence. That silence got interpreted as absence, and absence got interpreted as lateness. This is where the futurist lens starts to matter, because right now, in laboratories in Manila, in partnership with institutions in Europe and North America, researchers are applying technologies that simply didn't exist 30 years ago. Multispectral imaging can reveal text on artifacts too faded or damaged for the naked eye to read. Portable X-ray fluorescence can analyze the chemical composition of inks and dyes without destroying the artifact. Machine learning models trained on known Brahmic scripts are being used to identify and classify marks on artifacts that were previously dismissed as decorative. The question is no longer whether new evidence will emerge. The question is, what happens when it does? Consider the trajectory of similar discoveries elsewhere. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were properly analyzed using modern technology decades after their initial discovery, they rewrote significant portions of religious and linguistic history. When digital imaging unlocked the Archimedes palimpsest, a medieval prayer book that had been scraped and reused, it revealed mathematical treatises nobody knew had survived. Ancient history keeps getting revised upward. Older, more complex, more geographically distributed than the previous model predicted. Look, the Philippines is almost certainly next. There's a specific mechanism that makes Southeast Asian script history particularly prone to radical revision. Maritime cultures leave their evidence underwater. The South China Sea has thousands of shipwrecks, some of them more than 1,000 years old. Those wrecks carry cargo, ceramics, metals, sometimes preserved organic material in the right anaerobic conditions at the seafloor. The underwater archaeology of the region is still in early stages. What those wrecks contain in terms of written records, artifacts, or trade goods that illuminate the cultural exchange networks of the first millennium remains largely unknown. And here's the structural point that tends to get skipped in textbook summaries. The Philippines sat at the intersection of the most active trade networks in the ancient world. The archipelago connected East Asian maritime routes with those running through Southeast Asia toward India and the Arabian Peninsula. That position meant constant exposure to ideas, technologies, and scripts from multiple directions simultaneously. The assumption that Filipino writing arrived from one direction, from India through Java, through trade, may dramatically underestimate the complexity of how writing actually spread. Writing doesn't always travel in a straight line. To be honest, sometimes it converges from multiple directions at once, and what emerges is neither copy nor invention. It's something new forged from chaos. Think about what that model implies for Baybayin specifically. If Proto-Austronesian communities, the ancestral populations of Filipinos, Taiwanese indigenous peoples, Pacific Islanders, and much of maritime Southeast Asia, were already using proto-script traditions before the formalization of the Brahmic family in India, then the relationship between Baybayin and Sanskrit isn't one of child to parent. It might be closer to cousins, distant relatives sharing a common ancestor nobody has yet identified, really identified. The Austronesian expansion itself is staggering in scope. Starting from Taiwan somewhere around 3000 BCE, these seafarers spread across an enormous arc, through the Philippines, through Indonesia, across the Pacific to Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand, and westward to Madagascar. This was not a gradual drift. It was deliberate navigation using stars, swells, wind patterns, and accumulated knowledge passed through generations. These were not pre-literate people in any meaningful sense. They carried complex technical and cultural knowledge across open ocean. The idea that they had no proto-writing tradition during that expansion is an assumption, not a finding. And assumptions have a way of collapsing under new data. What does this mean for Filipinos alive today? The implications stretch forward, not just backward. When the Philippines reclaimed Baybayin, when activists, artists, and educators began pushing for its reintegration into public life starting in the late 20th century, they were doing something more significant than a cultural revival project. They were asserting that the Filipino relationship with literacy is not a gift from colonizers, not a product of Spanish missionaries or American educational systems. It predates both by centuries at minimum, by millennia possibly. That shift in self-understanding has material consequences. It changes how Filipino children perceive their place in history. It changes how the archipelago positions itself in global conversations about the origins of civilization. It changes the weight of the silence that colonial history imposed. A people who were told their pre-colonial selves were primitive, who were taught that literacy arrived on Spanish ships, are looking at evidence that their ancestors were writing when much of Europe still wasn't. The futurist dimension here is genuinely radical. Over the next 20 years, as genomic data from ancient remains becomes richer, as underwater archaeology matures, as AI-assisted decipherment tools become more sophisticated, the history of writing in Southeast Asia will almost certainly be rewritten. Multiple times, probably. Each revision pushing the timeline back, adding complexity. disrupting the clean narrative of Indian origin and colonial delivery. There's a catch. The scholars working on this know it. Some of them are cautious, professionally cautious, because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence is still fragmentary. But fragmented doesn't mean absent. It means scattered. And every year, a few more pieces surface. By the way, the Laguna copperplate was found near scrap metal, the Baybayin characters appearing on pottery shards, the trade routes documented in Chinese annals that describe Philippine communities centuries before any Spanish account. The pieces are there. The picture they form when assembled is one of a civilization with deep roots, sophisticated literacy, and a written tradition that nobody has yet fully mapped. Here's where this story reaches its sharpest edge. There's a dating study that's been proposed, a systematic, cross-disciplinary archaeological survey of the Philippine archipelago, combining underwater survey, isotopic dating of known artifacts, and comparative linguistic analysis of Baybayin against other Brahmic scripts using computational methods. The proposal has been discussed. The funding conversations have happened, but the full-scale study hasn't launched yet. When it does, and the researchers involved believe it will within this decade, the results may settle some questions definitively. The dates may surprise people, or they may confirm the conservative estimates. Either outcome matters, because the act of asking the question rigorously with modern tools is itself a form of historical justice. What that study might find in the deeper layers, in the material that has survived below the waterline and beneath the soil, in the artifacts that haven't yet been examined under multispectral light, that's a question still without an answer. The script is older than most people were taught to believe. How much older is the number that changes everything?